Today I'm talking about the Gevi 2-in-1 pour-over grinder coffee machine, and this has been quite interesting for me because originally I created a video, I created a review, and I talked about a lot of the problems I had with this. Really 3 big problems, which I will go over them. But what has happened in the past week or so, which is why I'm sort of redoing everything, is that Gevi got back to me, their product team got back to me, and they have addressed every single problem I complained about. So I really wanted to just talk about that. And then, of course, I'll talk about the machine and all of that. I'm going to be talking about my original problems with the Gevi, and those are really 3 really big problems that mostly relate to the software, and you'll kind of see why. But before that, I'm obviously going to give a brief overview of the machine, who's it for, who's it not for. Then I'll go into those problems that I talked about and how Gevi has addressed them. And then I'll go into pros and cons of the hardware, the 2 hardware components here. And I'll talk about what is it really like to use the machine, although that is going to be different for release models. And then I'll go into conclusions of this machine. So it is a 2-in-1 machine. There is a grinder, a brewer, and if you really want to look at the specs, you can just look at the Indiegogo. What I am going to tell you is who's this really for and who's it not for. This is obviously an automated pour-over machine. So the entire point here is that you just grind your coffee, you then get this all set up, and you run a profile. You can make your own profiles, do all of that good stuff, and every single time it's just going to execute whatever profile you use. So that's essentially just distributing hot water in a specific pattern. So theoretically speaking, your coffees should be very consistent. It should taste the same every single time. And because you can adjust different things such as flow rate, temperature, your coffee should just be really good. Like, you can simulate a lot of different styles of pouring. You can do so much with this machine, and you have pretty good flexibility in what you can really do. There just are, of course, a few quirks with that, and that all has to do with the UI, but a lot of that has actually been addressed, which is super fascinating to me. Now, I don't really think this machine is for folks who are looking for that very satisfying manual experience. This has to be brought up because for a lot of folks, pour-over is this Zen type of thing. They love pouring into coffee. It's an experience. It's fun, and it's incredibly satisfying and rewarding. Doing actually a really great pour-over does take a fair amount of skill. So by removing skill with automation, maybe that kind of rubs folks the wrong way because people want to hone their crafts. Now, I do want to say that I found this machine to be very enjoyable in customizing and just having fun by building my own profiles and experimenting and seeing what happens, which really I think is what a lot of you guys are going to be looking at this machine for, is let's just make profiles, execute them, and see what the result is in the cup. But for you purists out there, this is not for you. I don't think you're going to be swayed by a machine that is like this. So overall, it is a great machine that you can indeed make amazing coffee. The consistency is absolutely there, though there are a lot of quirks. And in my original set of feedback that I gave to Gevi, I had a lot of complaints about some really small things, and these were small things that killed the experience for me. I think a lot of people are just very skeptical about the software. What really ties this machine together is the software, the UI. There's literally a power button on here. You have to operate the rest using a touchscreen, and you have to deal with the software, the UI, and all of that. And all of my complaints were mainly related to that. The way I looked at this machine was that I had fun doing custom profiles, doing customizations, making my own profiles. The problem was that Gevi just kind of complicated things, or they really just made that experience of making profiles not so fun. And I spent a lot of time in my original set of feedback. I was like, why is it so unfun to make profiles? It really was this one part of the build your own profile process. And I think you might think this is I'm blowing this way out of proportion, but this just happened to me and it has pissed me off. But Gevi has solved it. So in the current flow of how you build out your own profile is you basically enter this recipe mode function. You then will build out your profile. You're going to add in your parameters. You're going to add in what ratio. You're going to add in all of that. The problem was that you had to let the machine run, and the machine has to execute the profile. That's fine. But the biggest issue with this was that if you tapped anywhere else during the entire process, if you just accidentally left, because the screen is not that accurate, by the way, is you would just lose your profile. Say I want to make a profile. I'm going to just say no, use other scales, do something random here, and it's just going to distribute water, which is incredibly frustrating to me sometimes. So I'm trying to just set a super low amount of water ratio here, 199. So I confirm and say, let's add some processes here. Okay, pour 10 mils per second. I have, say, I built out 5 different steps for the profile. Awesome, right? I hit start. It's just going to boil the water, and it's just going to do it. There is no indication here that the machine is just going to actually start pouring water, and you might not be ready for that. It's just going to do it. And I think that's really weird, considering other settings, like the barista mode, for example, have a confirmation to hit start and boil the water. So it's, of course, executing the profile perfectly. If I hit anything else, or if I leave this, all my progress is done. So in order for me to actually save the profile, I have to hit name your coffee. If I hit finished, it's gone. If I hit home, it's gone. So if you put in the effort, and making profiles is not that easy, or it could be more streamlined simply because this is such a small screen and you have to build your profile in here. If I hit anything else, that profile you put in all that effort in is going to be gone. You have to hit name your coffee, and you have to talk about it in here. I'm just trying to highlight some more inconsistencies in the menu. Say I go to barista mode. All right, barista mode, right? The most manual thing. You input away, and it's just going to check the ratio, and that is going to determine the total amount of water poured out. So hit confirm. All right. Once the water is finished heating here in barista mode, it then tells me, oh, do you want to start doing stuff? There is a confirmation screen as to when you're going to start pouring water. That to me was absolutely insane, because I was like, wait a second, you're not telling me that I could just lose all that progress? There's no exit screen, there's no confirm you want to leave? And I am happy to say that Gevi has solved that by adding a exit screen. Just to check, say, hey, are you sure you want to leave? And I think that solves so many problems right there. My second complaint with the Gevi was really down to this rotating head. This has been brought up in other reviews. This rotating head can only spin at a fixed RPM, and what basically would happen is in certain modes, and depending on what type of dripper you use, for example, if I used a flat bottom dripper or a wider dripper, if I just did a 40 milliliter or 40 gram bloom, only part of my grounds would be saturated if I used a higher flow rate. So essentially, that's because this head can only spin so fast. And the workaround was to just use lower flow rates when you distributed water to ensure that your grounds were all properly saturated during the bloom. I am happy to say that Gevi they've seen that feedback, and what they are doing is they're allowing you to change the head rotation speed. In those production models, the speed at which this head can spin will be adjustable, and that is something you'll also be able to program inside of the custom recipe modes. So that is awesome. So that is pouring water, and I'm going to stop it at 40. So 41. As you can see, the grounds over here on the right side there are completely dry. So even though I placed the dripper fairly centered underneath the pouring head, this part is completely dry. I also want to note that in here, there's no timer in the manual mode, which is kind of ridiculous. But I would really suggest you do a lower flow rate, like 3 mils per second for the bloom. And that's just because the head here can only spin so fast. So if I do 3 mils per second, you'll see that it is able to distribute the 40 milliliters in the entire circle. So it's actually able to cover all of the grounds as it goes through, because the flow rate is a lot slower. If I were to use a higher flow rate, say 7 or 8 mils per second, which would make a really fast pour, 40 mils basically already happens, it just only in a half circle there. The final thing which really killed the Gevi for me, and I am so happy that they solved this, was in the manual barista mode, there was no timer. It is absolutely insane to me that Gevi thought this was a good idea in a manual mode to not include a timer. Literally a timer that would count up. Even though there was a graph display that has an XY axis and you would be able to see time, it just wouldn't count. And in a manual pour, when you try to simulate doing a real pour, you have to look at the times. You're trying to count that 30-second bloom. You're trying to really figure out what your overall drawdown time is. But there was no timer in manual mode, which bothered me a lot. And I am so happy to say that Gevi has solved that. If you want to manually do your pours using the machine, of course this can go from 3 mils per second to 9 mils per second, there is no indication of your time, even though the graph will gradually fill up. So watch this. Hit start, I'm just pouring some water here. Say I'm trying to do a bloom. So you pause and you're trying to do the bloom. There's no indication here of time at all. So I don't know what time it is, and I think that's kind of ridiculous in a barista mode to not really have a timer, considering that's really what we want to see in terms of bloom time, right? Like, I don't know why even have this bottom section here if you can't display the actual time. But another inconsistency in all of this is, say I go into kettle mode, all these different places, especially for distributing water, just have confirmation screens that say, yes, do you want to distribute water? And when the machine is executing profiles, it just doesn't tell you that things are happening. And I find that incredibly frustrating because I feel like making profiles should be fun. See, here you can just actually say, yes, use the water. I just wish they told you when things are happening, because what if you were grinding the coffee and you're preparing everything and you didn't have it right underneath? And I kind of just really wish they just had like a start button that says start running the profile. Those are my 3 really big complaints regarding the Gevi, and a lot of it did have to do with the software, the user experience, and all of that. And that has all been addressed. So I don't really have too much to say anymore because it's been all taken care of. What I really want to spend time talking about now is why I think that's amazing. For those of you who do not know, launching a product is incredibly difficult. And I think it's just been so fascinating to me that I sent feedback back to Gevi, and they basically got back to me. They had engineers actually respond to my comments and say, hey, that's actually a great idea. Like, let's do something about it. They mocked up the software, they did all of that, and they clarified so many things for me. And I just think that's awesome to see that there's such a nimble product engineering team that is just there and can answer so many questions and is willing to take the feedback of users like myself and incorporate that to ensure that the launch product is much better than before. So I do want to say that this has been awesome. They're fixing all the problems that I had with it. You will 100% have to invest the time and effort to understand what all the functions do. How does that actually play into, like, what do the functions do from grinding coffee to brewing coffee, and how do you make it more streamlined? How do you adapt literally tapping different things on the screen to your workflow? So that is something that you are going to need to be aware of. Of course, this machine is not internet connected. There's no way to update the software. So you are going to need to deal with whatever final release software Gevi comes out with. But I think they are improving. They already are incorporating so much good feedback from users, and I think it's looking really good. And I'm just very happy that they are trying to empower you as a user to have a more convenient and easy experience to brew great coffee, because the hardware is great, but the software just wasn't really up to par, but it's getting there. And I really like seeing that Gevi was so willing to incorporate my feedback in there, and it's actually getting better. So that's great. Okay, so now let's talk about the hardware. Obviously, very pretty machine. I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of each of the sections, some quirks that I found, and obviously the limitations of all of this, and then I will finally conclude. So let me start off with the brewing unit. So this has been separated out into two different sections. There's this brewer and also the grinder, and there's a scale, but the scale is not so good, but I think they are working on that. But let's talk about the brewer. So the brewer here is essentially a glorified hot water kettle spout. It's all operated by a touchscreen. Essentially what this will do is whenever you're brewing coffee, it's going to boil water here. Nice touch that there is a little reservoir LED here so you can see how much water you have left. It's going to boil the water. It is then going to distribute water in 3 streams out of these nozzles here. These nozzles can go from 3 milliliters per second all the way up to 9 milliliters per second. So you can simulate a fair amount of pouring techniques. In the release model, you also will be able to adjust the speed at which the head spins, which is awesome. So you can even get more flexibility in what you do. The consistency at which the water is poured, I think, has been pretty awesome. It's going to be the same every single time. It's just pouring water, and it's tracked based on milliliters. Now, there are, of course, some limitations with the brewer. So the first one is that the brewer max temperature can only go up to 205 Fahrenheit. Now, I personally, on my normal kettle, I do brew with 205 Fahrenheit. So that really wouldn't feel like such a big deal. The problem is that because we're using 3 streams of water coming out of here, those streams of water are actually quite thick. So the instant that they come out of here, you're losing temperature. That is something you do want to keep in mind. Now, how you solve that actually is you move the grounds up and you try to move the grounds as close as possible. So I've taken like a little scale tray here and I've propped up my cup and I got the grounds much closer and I would get a superior cup. Another thing to keep in mind is that because you can move your brewer around, you want to make sure that your grounds are as centered as possible, and you will need to get a feel, depending on what dripper you're using, what type of craft you're using, of how the water falls from the spouts here, and you just want to make sure your grounds are, properly centered and all of that. The temperature itself is very consistent if you do keep in mind how far your grounds are from the spouts here. And I have gotten some absolutely amazing cups here, and it's always been consistent because it's just executing profiles that I've created, and it's the same every single time. There is also a kettle mode if you just want to distribute hot water. It can go up to 208, 210 Fahrenheit, but in the brewing mode, you can only go up to 205 Fahrenheit. Paired with this brewer is a grinder, and I actually think the grinder is massively, massively underrated. This is actually one of the easiest grinders I have ever worked with. And but let me first of all start off with the stuff that people are probably more interested in. Okay, 60 millimeter flats in here. It is steps, so you have 51 steps. You can go from a really coarse kind of French press cold brew grind size all the way down to almost good espresso. It will work for certain styles of espresso and with certain machines, but you really shouldn't use this thing for espresso in my opinion. But it is really nice to have that flexibility. I also want to say that this dial feels great to use. All of this is user serviceable, so you can indeed take this all apart. It is a pretty looking grinder. There is a hopper up top here. In the hopper lid, there is a little scoop, and this hopper will hold about 80-ish grams of coffee. It's nice to work with. It really is. Let me talk about some brief subjective taste test things that I've done with the Gevi. I'm finding the way that this presents acidity and notes and whatnot is like just it coats your tongue, and you're able to taste the flavor note. This is, of course, very subjective. You're not really getting that super sharp clarity and acidity presentation that you find out of something like SSP multi-purpose brews, but you're getting something that is somewhere in between like Ode 1.1 and the SSP brews. Like it's good enough in terms of acidity on those light roast coffees. I'm 100% getting those flavor notes. Though this is nothing too crazy, but it's pretty cool that it's on a machine like this. Now, what is even cooler is the user experience of using this grinder. This grinder has basically minimal retention and exchange. It's like 0.1, 0.2 grams. It's so low. And there is no static at all. These are flat burrs that spin really fast and can grind pretty fine, and there's no static at all. I think there's some sort of static removal mechanism in here, but it's fascinating that you just get so many great quality of life improvements here, which is, I'm just going to put beans in here, grind coffee. It doesn't spray anywhere. There's no static. There's like basically no retention. It just makes grinding coffee a joy. And I think that is so crazy to see in a 2-in-1 machine like this. I'm getting good enough quality of coffee, but the quality of life and using the grinder is so great. It's probably one of the easiest grinders I've ever worked with, in that there's no spray, no retention. It's clean. It works, and it's not that loud. I find it fascinating that it is melded onto this 2-in-1 machine, and realistically, Gevi should release this grinder by itself. What I do want to talk about is how fine this can go. So this unfortunately cannot go super fine on the espresso end. So I did use this as actually my main grinder for my espresso and for my pour overs, and it was really fascinating to just have something like a Flare 58 next to this and be able to use this for my pour overs, use this to preheat my Flare 58. But in terms of the grinding experience for espresso, you don't really get much adjustments. I think on the espresso end, you definitely would want more adjustments, but my particular grinder would only allow me to pull turbos. I was not really able to pull anything past 5 or 6 bars. It just wouldn't go fine enough for that, and I do want to mention that. But it was really cool to just have one unit and espresso machine and do everything there. I do think that these burrs do a fine enough job. Like, for most people, this is gonna be perfectly fine. And really, for most people who are trying to do pour overs, AeroPress, all of that stuff, you have the flexibility of grinding finer and extracting more and pushing those finer grinds, especially for lighter roast coffees, simply because you can grind to almost a full-on espresso grind size. I do really hope one day I'm able to check out the final release model of the Gevi and compare the original beta unit with the original software to the released software, because I think that is really where you're going to be able to see the biggest differences in how they've made coffee just easier to brew on the current model that you're going to be using versus the ones that a lot of us reviewers have been taking a look at. So it's just been a really fascinating experience, because I just didn't expect them to incorporate feedback so fast, and they got back to me, and they've just been so easy to work with, and it's just so cool to see that, and I love that so much. And I do want to thank Gevi for sending me this unit and allowing me to provide feedback to them, and I do really think this is a machine that a lot of you guys are going to enjoy. This is going to be that automated pour over coffee machine that is going to give you consistent cups every single time. You are going to need to learn about how to use it, though. You're going to need to invest that time and effort at the beginning, but once you do, I think you're going to be rewarded, because brewing that consistent cup every single day is going to be very convenient. I also want to say that you can 100% use this grinder for other brewing methods. In fact, I've used this grinder for my manual pours, and the results coming out of this grinder are pretty great. And it is nice to have that flexibility in grinding finer for pretty much all types of pour overs, as well as AeroPress. Though I do wish it ground a little bit finer for espresso, and they unfortunately told me that they aren't planning on making the burrs grind any finer, but it will kind of depend on what espresso machine you're probably using. Now that's it. This was just a great machine, and originally it was very tied down to the software. The software really was what killed it, in my opinion, but they fixed those problems, and while those problems that I mentioned were small problems, they really kind of messed up the user experience, but they solved those, and now this is a machine that I can 100% get behind. It is just a great machine at the end of the day. You have great hardware, it's also nice looking, but the software is really what tied it all together, and I am just so happy that Gevi has decided to incorporate feedback, and they were so open to suggestions and all of that from users. And it was just cool to see that they care about the customer. They care about what you are looking for,